We started planning this trip in early 23. We were happy that we were in good health and thought we could be okay going on that long a trip. Our luggage was about 150 pounds. One suitcase was damaged on the ship, but they sewed it up for us and it'll be fine for coming home. This was our ship, the Holland America Zuiderdam. It's one of their smaller ships. We had about 1,200 people on board out of Fort Lauderdale. Introduction to cruising was 3 days at sea before we got to Tobago. Tobago was someplace we'd been before, so we walked to the top of the hill to Fort George. Long walk up for about an hour, and of course coming down was much easier. No one is actually allowed on Devil's Island, but we were on a neighboring island looking across at it. It looks like a beautiful place, but if you had been sent there years ago, you probably never got out. A famous one was Papillon, and we watched that movie one night. We could see the cells, and sadly, a lot of people just ended up in this cemetery. There were a few that got away. We spent one whole day watching the water look like this. That was the Amazon Bar, which is the entrance to the Amazon River. It's shallow and dark and dirty. Stop in Brazil, it's called Alter do Chão. There was absolutely nothing to do there. We walked around, saw a church, and ended up in a swing. Boca de Valero, which was in Brazil, and it was a really poor place. The ship collected things to take and give to the people, and everybody came down to the dock with animals, the kids, to get their pictures taken and everything, and I really enjoyed that. Here's me with a sloth. This little girl had a pet parrot. This was kind of a soft-shelled armadillo. It can completely roll up. They don't call it an armadillo there. Every kid had a pet monkey. Went on a boat ride down the river, and it was kind of a dilapidated boat. Had to set really still. This was Manaus, Brazil, where we went on a tour called Exploring the Negro River. We got our picture with some local cops first because we thought that would add to the trip. They have pink dolphins here, and you can tell they're really pink too. Sometimes they say something like that, but it's not really true. These guys were pink. The Rio Negro River joins with the Amazon, and for more than 6 miles they run side by side without mixing because of different temperature and different type of water. This was fishing for a parakeet, which is about a 400-pound fish in the Amazon. They had fish on the line, but no hook, so Bill could only catch it, and it got away. The next trip was a walk through the jungle, and it was really muddy because it rained, and we got to this village where they were dancing for us. Parintins, Brazil has this folklore story about the earlier times when they fought each other and they were divided into red and blue. They put on a show for us, which was a festival. Santarém was our last stop in Brazil, and you could also see the meeting of the waters there where the rivers didn't join together. Out of Brazil and on to Grenada, which is a Caribbean island. We've been there before, so we just walked around. This tunnel was like taking your life in your own hands because there's cars in it with you. This is probably our 3rd time in Curacao, and so we went to an ostrich farm for something to do. You could pet them and feed them and see their eggs and that type of thing. Bill stood on one of the eggs just to show how tough they are. Next was an aloe vera plantation where they grew it for production of cosmetics. Curacao is where Curacao liqueur comes from. It's a blue liqueur, and so we had to have some signature drinks before we left. This is the ditch called the Panama Canal, and the only way to get to the Pacific from the Caribbean. Quepos, Costa Rica, is a fishing place where people go for game fishing. It was kind of an island. It was a tender port. We didn't do a lot there, but it was kind of interesting to see. We rode one of the local buses to this park that was a wildlife sanctuary. They only let so many people in a day, and we weren't there in time to get tickets. So we walked the beach and just enjoyed the weather. People who went to the park were kind of disappointed because they didn't see much wildlife. This was our first time in Manzanillo, Mexico. They have this huge sailfish downtown to show that they catch that kind of game fish there. Their main exports is salt, and they let it dry in these big beds, and then they rake it all together and put it in a bag. Very simple process. They have plantations with mangoes, papayas, some fruits you've never heard of, like ugly fruit, different things like that, that they also export. They also make bricks. They fire them in a kiln like this. It's a totally outdoor process, and they have these guys that just mix mud and water, and then they put them in a form. And this one guy said he'd do like 180 forms a day, and we figured he was making about $50. Our last stop was at a bar that was right on the water. It was a really pretty place. The weather was good, and our whole group stopped there for dinner. We had great guacamole that they had made, and of course a Corona. In Puerto Vallarta, the view from the ship is a big Walmart. We went there to do some shopping, and I got my hair cut at the barber shop. For us with the Puerto Vallarta sign. All along the boardwalk were statues of fish and mermaids and that type of thing. There were adult-sized rocking horses, so watch me ride side saddle. These arches were removed from a hacienda in Guadalupe and moved there to form a kind of a natural stage where they put things on. If you look real close, you'll see the church in the background that's in the next picture. This church is right downtown, and it's Our Lady of Guadalupe. We didn't know where we were going. It was a resort that was back in the mountains. We weren't sure what it was going to be like, but apparently it's used by celebrities and stuff to get away from the crowds. Our guide turned out to be both a bartender and a chef. He made great margaritas and guacamole to die for. I got pretty lazy after all of that. Well, we're in Hawaii, so back in the USA, it's good to see the flags and the post offices say US. This is a lava tube, which was where air was under the lava as it was flowing. People weren't coming to this church. It was one of the first churches in Kona, so the new missionary moved it to another place, and when he put it back together, he painted the ceiling. It's called the Painted Church. A national park, and in the olden days when people believed in gods and stuff, if a criminal got there, he could get an amnesty from the gods. This is Akaka Falls. It's 433 feet long, and if you wanted to, you could go down and swim in it. It was a long walk down there, so we didn't do that. We wanted to look very native in our shirts, and if Bill stood just right, he blended into the scenery. Another fall was Rainbow Fall. It made its own rainbows early in the morning. We weren't there to see that. Monkey pod trees are all over the island. Honolulu was beautiful, especially from 14,000 feet. There were 6 jumpers, 6 helpers, 3 photographers besides that, and we were all ready to go. And here I go. You can't stop now. There's my feet out of the plane. You free fall for about 50 seconds, and then you're on the chute for like another 5 minutes longer. Here I am coming down.
Where did Wanda go? She was here just a minute ago. Wow, now it's my turn to go. I'm jumping out of this airplane. Now I'm floating down, and any second I'm going to land. There I am. I'm on the ground again. I made it. And here's Wanda. I found her. She already was on the ground.
After all our bravery, we had our favorite Hawaiian dish, which is loco moco. It's a hamburger with an egg on top and brown gravy on top of that. February 14th didn't happen. We crossed the international date line that day, so no Valentine's Day. Of course, they celebrated later. In Guam, we lost thousands of men in the war. They came in on sleepy beaches like this only to find the Japanese hiding in the hills. This was a monument to their bravery and to their loss. Guam is a U.S. possession, so there's lots of monuments there and lots of U.S. activity. They found these stones that they built their houses upon back in prehistoric times. This was the entrance to a tunnel that the Japanese had built into the hills. This whole area of Guam was devastated. It was flat after the war, and of course they built many monuments. This is their Senate building, and it's hard to believe that they do belong to the U.S., so they have a Senate. A local legend of two people that fell in love, but their parents wouldn't let them get married, so they jumped off this cliff just so they could be together forever. The locals make a big deal of it, and they tie their hair together, and then they put it on a heart and lock it into this wall. We took this picture, but we didn't go so far as to jump to prove we loved each other. Saipan was the next island that we visited, which was, of course, in the war, too. We visited an old Japanese jail where they say Amelia Earhart was held before she was executed. Of course, that's still a big mystery, isn't it? The Army left lots of equipment there, and you can find it around the island. They say there's still a lot up in the hills and up in the mountain. When the tide's out, there's even some out here in the bay. The island has monuments to peace and to the fallen soldiers. The locals had a performance of dancing to see the ship off. Our first view of Japan with the rising sun out over the water. The first two islands are actually Okinawa, but that's all part of Japan. Ishiaki Island was the first point in Japan. It was like a really pretty resort area where people do a lot of diving. It's completely surrounded by coral reefs. Japan is very clean, but it's because they have a lot of don't signs everywhere. The other thing, we were told they have 5 million vending machines there. You can get hot and cold drinks from a vending machine. Shisha Park, this was where they had really made a bunch of shishas, which is a folklore god to protect your home and keep you safe. Here's Wanda lost among the shiskas. I bought some magnets. The male has his mouth closed, the female has their mouth open, so our home will be safe from now on. They cultivate black pearls here, so there's little floats out in the water and they harvest them. This was just a mock-up in a museum. We had a typical lunch which had ramen and a hot plate. It's like a broth with noodles and it has eggs and pork in it. The other thing was sushi made with Spam. They love Spam in these islands. We lost our heads over this kimono outfit. Naha was our next port, finally something we could pronounce. Cherry and plum blossoms are just about out, so we found a few that were early bloomers. Underground cave, that was where the headquarters for the Japanese Army was. It was left just the way it was so you could see, and sadly this is where some of their top commanders committed suicide rather than surrender. These streamers are made up of thousands of origami peace doves, and they really talk peace all over the island. There's a lot of memorials to the dead, and about 150,000 Okinawan civilians got killed just due to the cruelty of the Japanese Army. They even made them jump off a cliff like this to commit suicide. As you can imagine, there's shrines all over Japan. We were on shrine overload at one point. Land is at a premium in Japan, so their mall was a high-rise. All the furniture, clothes you could imagine, and the basement was a food court. We watched them bake these little fish goodies, and they put lots of things in them, even vegetables. They cost like $1 US. This was a good sight to see the ship again because we'd walked all over Naha. You never find any trash laying on the streets. It's an unbelievably clean and safe place to be. There are 1,450 shrines in Tokyo, and the tour we were on tried to go to all of them. They're beautiful, but they just get a little bit much. Cherry blossoms were starting to bloom, but their big deal is later in the spring. In the afternoon, we went on a walk by ourselves, and we had the destination to find the Statue of Liberty. Who knew there was one of those in Tokyo? It was given to them by France. One of the first buildings I took a picture of was this building, never knowing that I'd get to go in it later. The entrance to the building was 7 stories of escalators that went up to an elevator. Where we got on the elevator, here we are finally at the top at the observation tower. Mount Fuji, and it wasn't even pretty. Wait till later and we got beautiful shots of the mountain. France gave him another monument called the Flame of Liberty. Outside the shopping mall was this huge robot, and about every hour it came alive and moved around a little bit. The architecture there was wonderful. All the buildings are new and modern and very tall. We visited a science museum that had many robots in it. An interesting exhibit was this freestanding stairway that circled around the Earth. Their best invention is their toilets. I guess they export thousands of them every year because everybody's trying to get them. They're warm-seated and spray you. There's almost every American company you can imagine, and this Red Lobster was really a big deal. Of course, we opted to eat in a Japanese food court with the rest of the noon crowd. We walked over 16,000 steps while we were touring Tokyo. Glad to see the sign to get back to our ship. A local dance group came on that were unbelievable. They had a little kid that was 7 years old that kept up with the adults. Kobe was the next big city, and the town was anxious for Holland to be there because it was the first time ever. So the fire boats came out and recognized us when we came into the harbor. We didn't have any excursions there. We planned our own tour, and we got on kind of a hop-on, hop-off where we could go different places around Kobe. We got off at one place where the rich merchants lived in the 1900s. It was absolutely wonderful, and most of it wasn't roped off. You could just go right up to these dresses and to the art exhibits. This is me with my Japanese fan. In this area, even the manhole covers were decorated. Kobe has the water to the south and the mountains to the north. We went up on a tram ride up in the mountains and rode down over town. There was even a waterfall. This is like just almost in the center of Kobe. We got to Kobe Chinatown before lunch, so we weren't really hungry, but we had some Kobe beef as sushi and also some Chinese noodles and some Kobe beer. The Kobe area had a tremendous earthquake in '95 that killed 5,000 plus people. They had a monument to that down on the waterfront, and a left part of the waterfront the way it was after the earthquake, just as a reminder of how bad it was. The park this is in has works of art, and it was a Sunday afternoon, so families around. The sun was actually out. There's a museum. There's lots of entertainment there, and it's again very clean and beautiful flowers. Most cities have these signs with their name on it. Their motto is Be Kobe. We waited to get a shot of us, so it's not the best that we've had. This was my uniform for most of the Orient. I bought the jacket in Japan. I had the hat with me, and I guess I looked like a typical tourist. It was usually like 50. Sometimes the sun was out, sometimes it wasn't, so I wore this. As we were leaving, they had a high school band come, and they released balloons, and it was a really big deal. People from Kobe were all out. Played Anchors Away, and the Coast Guard was telling us bon voyage. On the way up the coast, we did get to see Mount Fuji in all its glory. It was beautiful, and I was really glad to get to see it. There's a strait that separates two parts of Japan. It's called the Kanman Strait, and it's a narrow passageway. They had to get a pilot to get the ship through there. There's a half-mile-long bridge that goes between these two parts of Japan, and they use that for car traffic. There's also tunnels and a lot of cables that go under the ocean there. Shanghai, China was our next port of call. Neither of us had been there before. More temples, but now we're into Buddha. This was the Laughing Buddha. This was the Reclining Buddha. Even though it was cold, they had beautiful flowers and decorations along the roads. So many tall buildings, and we just loved them. They were so pretty, all different, and lots of good architecture. They called this one the Flower Building. This is the third tallest building in the world. A Chinese garden that a man built for his parents, and you can see the pagoda and the tall building in the same shot, the old and the new. It wasn't a huge garden, but it had lots of rock things and like this dragon and many, many things to see. We stopped for lunch at a Chinese restaurant, of course. They brought out 13 kinds of food. We all sat around a table for 10 with a turntable. We rode on a futuristic maglev train. This means that it's levitating and a magnet is what propels it. There's no engine. The trip was a short one and it only got to 301 kilometers, but it can get to 500 if it's a longer trip. The next thing was to go in an 88-story building. The elevator there went 30 feet in a second. It was a really quick trip to the top. Now we look down on all the buildings that were pictured earlier from the ground. There's a circular observation deck. Actually, some people pay to walk on the outside of the building. We did not do that. Back on the ground, we took a picture of the 3 tallest buildings looking up. Real estate is so expensive per foot that most people have to live in apartments. They hang their laundry outside. It was amazing to us how few times you saw the flag, not like in the US where it's everywhere. It was basically just on government buildings. That was our welcome to Dalian. Next we went to People's Square. The big red balls are left over from their New Year. Because it was Sunday and the children were out of school, they put on a concert for us at the museum. It was wonderful. We had about 4 busloads of Holland America people there. These girls were a little older and they were dressed in typical opera costumes. Guess what? There's a Walmart there too. This is the entrance to an underground store. There are lots of cleaning people on the streets. That's why it's so clean. They have nice cars, and we even saw this pretty new RV. These ladies were dancing in Labor Park just for the fun of it. They don't pass the hat. They just have fun dancing. A corporation called Wanda. I had to take a picture of that. Another beautiful building. The buildings were all lit up at night. This was off the deck of the ship, and it was just so pretty as we were sitting there waiting to sail off. Tianjin, China is the port they use for people wanting to get to Beijing. We had been there to see the Great Wall and the soldiers before, so we didn't take that. We stayed in Tianjin. The first afternoon we went to this huge mall, and they had food courts that they delivered the food to the people on a conveyor belt. Our tour guide was really great. Her message to us was that she had been afraid to give a tour to Americans, thinking we hated all Chinese people. Then she said that if people could just be with people, everybody would get along and be happy, leave the governments out of it. We had a long tour today, and one of them was a mansion that was built by a guy that did shipping in the 1800s. This was one of his nice things out his window. Yes, I was out in the country, so I finally had to use one of these. There are a lot of restrictions for driving cars, so a lot of people use motorcycles. They attach these comforters to the front of it and have built-in mittens to put their hands in. Most people can't afford a car, so there's these motor scooters and bicycles all over that they can just ride wherever they want to and leave them, and they charge it on their iPhone. It was cold in China, and yet this guy had on shorts. He was from Great Britain. We went in this marvelous museum. It had all kinds of storylines and pictures of the wars they've had, but we didn't have time to really see it. You remember the old Confucius say? Well, this was Confucius. He lived in this area many years ago. Back to the terminal after riding the bus forever. Kenny Martin was one of the stars that they brought on the ship. He was from England and he's great. He agreed to give me a clarinet lesson. Highlight of my trip, Hong Kong, China started with an onshore dragon parade with drums and lots of entertainers. More tall buildings, and these were even more fabulous than we'd seen before. The roads just kind of intertwined between the buildings, and it certainly would be easy to get lost there if you were driving. The cable cars left over from the British rule, they were double-deckers. There's markets all over and people galore, you can imagine, with as many people that live there. Also lots of hills. Ferry before, but it's also kind of an iconic thing out there. 20-minute ride across the bay and back. We had one clear day and one really smoggy day. They say it's like smog and also sand from the desert. Sampan in the fog. An old airport runway was turned into this new cruise terminal. It has a rooftop garden and it was a beautiful place to walk and see the top of our ship. Bill celebrated his 79th birthday. They thought it was our anniversary too. I don't know where they got that idea, but they put all this on our bed that night. The next day was St. Patrick's Day and we had to have green drinks. I'm sure you've seen Bill's shirt before. He's worn it at Southport. Good morning, Vietnam. There's lots of rice paddies and the people still work the fields by hand, although they do have water buffalo. We found out if a water buffalo isn't in the water like 3 or 4 hours a day, it'll die. We started out in Hoi An, which is an ancient city away from Da Nang. This was a working factory where they made things out of silk, some silk worms. And this is a lady making silk thread. And this one was embroidering. I had to think of me with my cross stitch. This was an English bar still celebrating St. Patrick's Day. We helped them celebrate with a tiger beer. Our first Vietnamese food, which we really enjoyed. Keep bringing food and you don't really know what you're eating. Outside Da Nang is a marble mountain. They create lots of lovely statues there. Da Nang has a beautiful beach on the China Sea, and this is where the American GIs who were stationed there took R&R. This is a giant female Buddha, 65 meters high. It stands on a mountain, and it was for the mariners to wish them luck as they left for the sea. The entire hillside was a shrine with beautiful buildings and gardens, another one of Vietnam's surprises. Good night, Vietnam. Singapore had dock entertainment when we got there. They don't accept dollars, so we exchanged them, and some countries have such pretty money. The most imposing feature is the super trees. They've got like 18 huge trees between 25 meters and 50 meters tall, and you can go up in the one as an observatory. They also have lights in them at night. The Singapore Flyer is 165 feet tall. It never was running while we were there. This is the Marina Bay Sands Hotel owned by the Sands in Vegas. We wanted to go up in it, but we were 10 back in line and we didn't get tickets. The food court at Marina by the Bay was called Jurassic Nest, and once an hour the dinosaurs came to life. This waterfall is 138 feet tall. It's the tallest indoor waterfall. One view from the bottom and one view from the top. It's 2 acres full of flowers and all kinds of statues. It was a beautiful place to be. We really enjoyed it. Just an example of some of the flowers. Another building called the Flower Dome had setups like this Japanese garden, which was real popular right now. This is a sculpture of 60 endangered species around the world. It's over 600 feet long, and it's the longest in the world. Dragonfly Lake is a lake you can walk around, and it also has a bridge that connects to the hotel. Second day in Singapore, we went to a wet market, which is actually called that because they wash the floor a lot from the meats and vegetables. Singapore doesn't allow street hawkers with food. They made them come to this building, so it's a lot safer to eat the food. They call pedestrian walkways zebras. I thought it was funny. Singapore was English at the time of the Japanese invasion in the war, so the cemetery was built for the English. They also had notorious prisoner of war camps, but there was a group that built this church during that, and they were able to preserve it and move it. Had to stop at one more Buddhist temple. It was the largest in the city. They're beautiful with all the statuary, but after a while we were getting tired of temples. The Raffles Hotel is world famous, and supposedly they have a dinner for $400 a piece. It's like about 15 courses. Of course, we didn't go there. Instead, I had a Singapore sling on the ship. Sri Lanka as the sun was coming up. They brought out a dance troupe with lots of entertainment as we were unloading the ship. We docked at the cargo cruise terminal, which is about 1,200 acres. It's the biggest one on the Indian Ocean. We had a shuttle take us from the ship to another port where they had all the tuk-tuks for taking you on tours. We had to have said no to like 500 people that we didn't want a tour. Some of the port area had very poor housing. You have to feel sorry for the people. There was a market right by the ship, and we could go buy us some Sri Lanka clothes that had elephants on it. Just what I wanted. Since we were in a cargo port, these huge cranes stood above our ship. It's kind of an interesting picture to highlight them against the night sky. This was the Lotus Tower. We kind of wanted to go there during the day, but you heard about the tuk-tuks, and we kind of stayed away from it. It's 1,100 foot tall. With the war in the Middle East intensifying, Holland changed our tour in February to go around Africa to come home instead of the Suez Canal. Maldives was our first stop on the changed itinerary. The Maldives is the further south of any Asian country. It's 26 islands that spread over quite a distance, and they're different sizes from just having no people on them to having a very crowded city. They didn't have a cruise center, they had just a landing dock for our tender. A municipal building with their flag. I have no idea what this sign says, but I thought it was neat. The Maldives is Islam, and it was Ramadan, so we couldn't even buy a beer on shore. Here I am at the Sultan's Garden, just acting like a harem girl. The Maldives is a wonderful place for diving. We're kind of beyond that, but we did walk to one point where you could see fish and stingrays just in the water. Their principal export is fishing, and they have like 200,000 tons of tuna out of there every year. They don't let any other countries fish in their water, so they're able to just get it for themselves. In 2004, they had a bad tsunami where 82 people were killed, and 2/3 of the island was flooded during the first few hours of the day, so this monument was to honor those that were killed. Our second day was Easter Sunday. This is another of their Islam mosques. The main island of Mali doesn't actually have a beach, so they made one. The Chinese gave them money to construct this long bridge to connect that island to the island with the airport. We spent the day walking to the other side of the island from where we were yesterday. With Florida-like weather, it's good to find a place to rest. There are 15,000 registered motorcycles in Mali. 1 in 6 people has one, and when you're walking on the streets, it's really dangerous. Even the women in their burqas are allowed to ride motor scooters. Almost every port you come into requires you to have a pilot boat. This was at the Seychelles, and they sent their boat out early. Seychelles is one of 115 islands. The city of Victoria is where we were. In the park, they have some land tortoises, and some of them are very old, like 100 years old, and they're all huge. We were able to feed them. They really seem like the last prehistoric animals on Earth. This one was trying to eat me. I really had trouble getting this I Love Seychelles sign because it was on the busiest corner in town. It was by the little bend that sits in the middle of the town. We went out for a sunset cruise on a catamaran. They never raised the sail, but yet it was a nice trip. The islands in the Seychelles are granite, which is unusual. Most islands are coral, made for some really pretty viewing. They anchored in a cove so we could watch the sunset. When we came in, it was dark, and Bill took this neat picture of the ship. The next day we went out on another trip, and part of it was to go in a glass-bottom boat. We saw lots of the little fish, but Bill took this picture of a big guy. They gave us bread to feed the fish, so now you know why they're outside of the boat. Most of the ship went snorkeling, but we opted to go to this island called Moyane Island. I remembered sailing out of here in 2014. They had wind turbines. They were new then, but of course everybody sees them now. Our next stop was Zanzibar. At one time it was a separate country, and the other part was Tanzania. The two of them went together to make Tanzania. The month of April is Ramadan in the Muslim countries, so we've had to wear clothes that covered your knees and shoulders, not eat and drink in public, not hold hands, that type of thing. That's what they observe. At night's the only time they eat. The harbor was full of boats, and they have a lot of these boats called a dhow, which has a single sail. It's a very poor country. The women carry things on their heads like in most African places. Lots of motorcycles. This truck looked like it'd seen better days. At the end of Ramadan, they have a festival, and it's real close now, so people were in town buying up things for that. It was raining, so there were lots of umbrellas. They even have an umbrella for their motorcycle. I don't think this chicken was a pet. I'm sure it ended up in a pot at the end of the day. Zanzibar was big in the slave trade back in the 1800s. And of course they showed no mercy in how they handled them. This church was built in the center of the slave trade after it was over. The tour guides wore these outfits, and what he was explaining here was that the door had these knobs on it to keep the animals from busting the door down. Their claim to fame is that Freddie Mercury was born there. He only lived there till he was 8 years old, but they still like to claim him. His group was called Queen. For dinner, we had Zanzibar pizza. It's dough wrapped around meat and cheese. The ship had a local group on for the evening entertainment called the Tanzania Boys Circus. As part of the group, they had this contortionist that was unbelievable. The second day was rain again, but we had to go look for some damn red monkeys. We sloshed through mud and trees, and it was like an unbelievable thing for us to do. We did find the red monkeys. From the front, they look pretty much like any other monkey. What's unique about them, unlike any other monkeys, they have 4 fingers but 5 toes. Here was 2 junior monkeys, and they were looking us over, and at one point the one whispered in the other one's ear, "Look at these fools out here in this weather." Traffic going home was terrible. We did finally see a policeman trying to direct this mess. It took an hour and a half to go 30 miles just to get back to the ship. They had a local singing group come on, and Zulu language has clicks instead of some of the letters, so it's really interesting to hear. Maputo, Mozambique, has this big bridge that the Chinese built with them for $725 million. It's the longest suspension bridge in Africa. The town has a few big buildings like banks and very few hotels. A few pretty things there was this railway station built in 1908. Sadly, most of the town looked like this. A central market is still essential to all these people in order to get the food for their daily existence. The Portuguese actually landed there in the 16th century, but they built this fort in 1791. Maputo's on a river and it connects two cities, and this was the same bridge as before at sunset. They had a beautiful terminal building for the ship. One reason to stop here was to get fuel. We had lots of fuel stops along the way. A tanker comes alongside and they transfer the fuel that way. Some of the few pretty spots in Durban, the ship crew warned us about being careful off the ship, that there was a lot of pickpocketing and it was pretty bad, especially if you were by yourself. This was a good use of space. They had a golf course inside the track for a horse race. Apparently they hold big meets there. Another good use for space was a cemetery. The coast was very rough, and as you can see on this sign, they warn you about everything. They didn't have to worry about me going in. It's a rugged coastline with lots of rocks. One feature along the coastline was this hole in a wall. It was a rock and you could walk through it. For the residents, they have tidal pools. The ocean's tide controls the depth in the water. These guys had an impromptu volleyball game going. Aside from the tidal pools, they warn everybody to stay out of the water because of the riptides. Eucalyptus grows wild there, and during the pandemic, they used that for tea and for breathing, and they got rid of the pandemic in the area from that. They took the local pilot on at the terminal, but it was so windy they couldn't pull a boat alongside to take the pilot off. This was a dangerous operation for the pilot, and I don't think they do it very often. After the fact, we found out that the pilot was a lady. When we arrived in Cape Town, South Africa, the port was closed. That was because of this intense fog. We did make our tour that afternoon to Stellenbosch, which is in the heart of wine country. Most of Africa is in the southern hemisphere, which means it's below the equator and it's going into their winter. Miles and miles of vineyards were actually in this dormant stage. The town was formed in the 1600s by the Dutch. It changed ownership a few times, but these old houses remain that we went in on a tour. This was a really special piano. There's supposedly only 6 of them left. The strings are above the piano, so it made it an upright. We felt like we were in the U.S. with all the election signs. Especially in South Africa, it's important because they're going to change parties perhaps from what's been in power since apartheid. We had a wine tasting at Blauwenklippen Winery, which is one of the famous wineries in South Africa. The winery had huge parking lots and they were up to date, even with an electric charger, which Bill had to investigate. South Africa has a ridge of mountains running through it, and this is Table Mountain, which is just at Cape Town. The sun was coming out, so up high we were able to take this cable car to the top. It was about a 4-minute ascent, and it held about 50 people. The fog was lifting down over the town, and this picture shows that you could just barely see the ship. These little varmints were called dassies. Some people call them rock rabbits. As if anybody would sit on a wall. Oh wait, Bill was trying it. In the same range as Table Mountain, there's a hill called Lion's Head. We spent the afternoon in Cape Town in the marina area. It was a beautiful afternoon. We went to the aquarium and Bill took a picture from inside the fish tank. An iconic item on the waterfront is this clock tower that's been there since 1882. This is us with Table Mountain in the background. Here we were in 2014 in the same spot. We still wear those same jackets. Cape Town is just a long way from anywhere. The last day we went on a 1-day safari, which was about 2.5 hours from Cape Town. They welcomed us with drinks. We drove around the property in a 4x4. We saw hippos, we saw rhinos, we saw water buffalo, we saw lions, giraffes, zebras, elands, which is a very large antelope, elephant, and ostriches. Bill bought some souvenir rhino socks. The next town was about 200 miles north of Cape Town, and it was in Namibia at a town called Luderitz. It's a very isolated location that was founded by the Germans, and it was famous at one point for diamond mining. We went on a catamaran called the Penguin and went up the rocky coast. Our captain was telling us about the sights. There's lots of deserted buildings on these islands where people lived at one time. Halifax Island was our destination, and it's the home to a colony of penguins, has lots of seals and dolphins. All along the African coast we had trouble with fog in the mornings. We had a great captain, and he was able to come into the bay with zero visibility. The bay we were coming into was Walvis Bay, Namibia. It's where the sand dunes meet the ocean. It's a beautiful place. Sand dunes are really high, and of course the wind blows them so that it's a different scenic view every day. Bill made it to the top after slipping and sliding all the way up. This was inside the vehicle. It doesn't really show the steepness of the hill. Being miles from anywhere and in the middle of the desert, this was a welcome sight. There are some animals that survive out there. There's a plant that's like a cucumber that keeps them with water and food. Speaking of food, we had a nice spread out in the sand dunes. There's lakes that's actually red from all the minerals in the water, and this is where they collect salt. There's mounds of salt. In the afternoon, we went on a boat trip into the lagoon, and it went over to a peninsula where there's a lot of flamingos and seals. The flamingos in this area are known as great flamingos. They have very long legs, and there's thousands of them. Most of them are pretty pink from the water. The peninsula was full of seals. It was the baby seals that were fun to watch. They were in the water playing. The seals were all around the boat playing, and there was one guy who came up the swim ladder and got on the boat and stood there for a while, and we were able to feed him fish and take pictures. They called him Bobby. It was a very windy day, so it was a good day for humans to play in the lagoon too. Holland America supports a project called Project Lioness, and it's where the ladies on the ship make blankets for sick kids. The ladies are always knitting and crocheting through shows and everything, and at the time of this picture, they've made 400 of these. There's a man that's behind this project, and he and his wife collect yarn. They buy yarn from the manufacturer. They end up with 9 dish packs full of yarn that they bring to the ship in a U-Haul trailer. There were 13 special blankets that they auctioned off. They were made by people away from the cruise, and they were just beautiful. I couldn't resist this moonshot one night. It was so pretty out there. There's a place off of Africa that they call Null Island. It's null because it's 0 latitude and 0 longitude, and it's the only place in the world where that comes together. So the captain went by there, and he stopped the ship, blew the horn, and we all enjoyed Null Island. Of course, there's nothing there. At one time, they had a weather buoy out there, but it got hit by a ship and sunk, so there's absolutely nothing but water. This was when the captain was shutting down the engines. He also turned the ship around 360 degrees and then took off again. They had a party at the pool where people were jumping in to appease King Neptune. I just took my picture with him. I made a cross stitch to signify the day. It's amazing the lengths people go to for nothing. Takoradi is a huge port in Ghana. It's on the west coast. We crowded in a bus to go downtown. They charge you $75 each for a visa, so we might as well see what was there to see. The shuttle bus left us off at Market Circle. Mainly it was foodstuffs, sunglasses, cell phones. They had a lot of spices, and here's a bowl of salt. The handicraft vendors were outside the ship, so we really wouldn't have had to go downtown. I bought this bead necklace. One thing Holland America makes a big deal about is the King's birthday. They call it King Day and request everybody to wear orange. They handed out orange wigs. The best thing about King's Day was these Boshi bowls, which is a huge cream puff covered in chocolate. We usually don't have desserts, but we fell for this one. Banjul, the Gambia, is a very small country. They charged us $150 each for a visa, even if we didn't get off the ship. It's a strange little country that just cuts into Senegal. All we've ever seen here was dust. The trees have dust. Even a tugboat has dust, which is really unusual. They probably have some pretty flags flying, but not around the water. This was a ferry boat with a really tattered flag. We didn't do anything there. We didn't go on any tours. And after all, we'd paid $150 for nothing. The vendors were outside the ship trying to sell their wares. Some of these small countries don't have much source for power, so there's these things called power ships that set in the bay and give them power. Mindelo, Cape Verde, is off the northwest side of Africa, and it's a place we stop for fuel, and we got 8 days till we get home. This was a great reminder for people to be more cautious about what they throw in the water and what it does to the sea life. They have some pretty things along the shore, like statues to make some pretty things, but it's basically a tired old town. It was a Saturday when we were there, and people were bringing in fish, and there were vendors selling fish to the locals. That's a big deal with them, and they also dry the fish. Including the walk to town, we were here for an hour and a half. We were here back in 2014, and it hasn't changed a lot, so we didn't have anything to see. It's always good to find the Zider Dam again. The last stop was San Juan, Puerto Rico. This is the iconic fort that sits in the harbor that we've seen many times. We'd never seen their state house, and it was nice to see the American flag again. They had statues of most of the American presidents, at least through Obama. They forgot to put the crack in the Liberty Bell. This was a really pretty Holocaust monument. This seahorse was right down by the ship, and it was really pretty. It seems most towns have these big Ferris wheels. We didn't ride on it. This was Derby Day, and the activities crew all played like horses. They had the best hat competition, and this was my hat with feathers on it, and I won some roses. My theme was that I'd collided with a parrot, therefore I had the dead parrot on my head. Holland America is big on giving out medals and pins, and this was for like 394 actual days we've spent on their line. If you've ever been on a cruise, you know they like to do these little zoo animals for your room, and this was a special display they had that they'd done lots of work for. It looked like they may have not had a guest talent show, but when they did, I was sure I signed up. I wasn't even nervous in front of this huge crowd. I had lots of comments, and they all enjoyed it. Here's a little sample of what I played. There were 12 acts, and we all had a good time. The day before we left the ship, they had a big rally for all their people. They have over 700 employees, and they're from 49 different countries. They're all wonderful. The people are what make the guests want to come back year after year, as some of them do, but at least for now, we're not planning on another world cruise in the near future. May 11th, the 128th day of our 4-month cruise. And Bill was checking the room one last time. Our luggage is somewhere in this mess outside, and we did get it all back. We're just waiting for a car to go home.